What is gauge, and why would it matter to you? Here's a sample of yarn labels recommending gauges for various types of yarn. I will demonstrate to you using these 5 different sizes of knitting needles: 15, 11, 10, 6, and 2. With the exception of the top yarn, I didn't have the right size of knitting needles for that. That being said, I am demonstrating each of these yarns with a respectively thick or thin needle, as you see the sizes displayed over the yarn. Here are a few swatches designed to follow the recommended gauge. This is lace weight silk yarn. A slightly thicker yarn on the size 6 needles. A worsted weight yarn on size 10. Something a bit bulkier on size 11. Really, this should have been like a size 17 or 20, I can't remember, but I only had a size 15. So what happens if you use the same yarn on different kinds of needles? I used a worsted weight yarn, wrapping it 15 times around each needle, as you see here. Despite the fact wrapping yarn around each needle 15 times, you get different quantities of yarn used for the same number of loops. As a result, you're going to want to play around and experiment from time to time. And of course, do what is best for your intended project. Here are a few swatches that I have made. On size 7 needles, size 9, and size 11. All using worsted weight yarn, and notice how it's getting progressively bigger as I progressed further up the size of knitting needles. Be mindful though, stitches also can affect the gauge very easily. Despite the fact that every square has the same number of stitches, notice how the 1x1 ribbing is much more narrow than the stockinette stitch or the garter stitch. Garter stitch is a bit shorter than when you were seeing the stockinette stitch or even the seed stitch. This is another thing you will want to take into account. Fiddle around with your stitches and see what size is best for you. Here are some common tools that you can use to measure your gauge. You have pins, good old-fashioned pins. You can simply use them to mark your work at different points. Then there's measuring tape. Of course, measure in your respective inches, fractions thereof, or centimeters if you're metric. You can also use this to measure the gauge, the length and the width created by your respective rows and stitches. This here is a special tool with a little window that you use to measure. As you see, you've got inches on both sides. That being said, you don't need to strictly follow the recommended gauge. You'll usually have a little bit of wiggle room. Generally, you will want to knit a small square or rectangle using your chosen yarn, needles, and stitches respectively. Then count the number of rows and stitches and how many inches or centimeters they then create. Finally, figure out how big your project is going to wind up being and stock up on the yarn accordingly. Failure to take gauge into account, you may end up knitting a sweater for a stuffed animal rather than your child. Or perhaps a sweater for yourself might end up being too big or not sufficiently warm if intended for cooler temperatures. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more knitting.